Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I was told to announce that this will be simultaneously translated for those who wish, French to English and English to French. Got that right? You noticed that the water spilling. I think that was champagne for the birthday. It's an honor to be here on the 100th birthday tomorrow. That's a big deal. So, a few questions, a couple of answers, and then we'll go through. I ask as we get ready, why is he so widely respected? Why have so many people been so impacted by his work? We'll talk about that. I think there's a couple of attributes: honesty, integrity, compassion, but maybe most of all, empathy. He feels deeply for people, and that's apparent, and we all feel what he feels. He cared so deeply about so many people, and it comes through. Some of us will know that he did not have patience for those who wished to take advantage. He had a very strong BS factor filter, but he could be extremely generous with the people who were authentic, and did that over and over again. And I think that comes through both the brutal side and the incredibly kind and compassionate side. And it comes to the pictures, and we all feel it. All of us who have a sensitive human nature will feel that. I was asked to speak a minute about the foundation. Robert and June had no children of their own. Robert lost both of his children. And Andrea died first, and then when Pablo died, Robert became very uninterested in thinking on the future. But he did never stop working. So we worked with him over and over to say, Robert, you can do whatever you want with your work in your life, and we'll help you do it. But with decisions you haven't made, give us some guidance, and we'll take care of it. So 35 years later, he took care of a lot of decisions, put a lot of the work at the NGA, as Shara did some of the great shows. But his instructions were, and he said it over and over again, and I will read to get this right, he said, do the right thing. That's it. Do the right thing. And those were our total instructions. So when we inherited the work, the photographs, the negatives, the films, and I'll show you a picture in a minute, we said, what do? We looked at it, we protected it, we put it in archival sleeves, and we picked up hundreds of prints, some really good ones, and many things the world had never seen. Many pictures the world had never seen, including about 70 cans of film, movie picture film. So what do we do with that? So we looked at it. Did you do that or did I do that? This is his studio. This is where he worked every day. He had two desks. The one on the left was sort of more creative mess, and the one on the right was where he did his more organized. And he would sit in that swivel chair and go between the two desks. What I want to show is how astonishingly organized he was, sort of. I say Robert was three things. He was Schweizerdeutsch, he was high Bohemian, Haute Bohemian, and squirrel. He had the incredibly organized sense of his Swiss upbringing, the Bohemian, but not the low, the high. He got stuff organized. And squirrel, he'd put things in boxes and mix them up. In the Peru box, there'd be pictures of Paris, and in the Paris boxes, there'd be pictures of Cairo. Whether he did it on purpose to confuse those who came through, or whether he did it just to create an endless puzzle, we'll never really know. But he did enjoy mixing things up and sharing them in a way. So after this, I want to share a couple of pictures about what his life was like. This is where he worked every day. This is the front yard of the house in Mabou. I had the good fortune of being with him 8 or 9 times up there. We arrived one time in the spring, and the stairs were gone. No problem. We went down to the beach and picked up driftwood. I brought up the driftwood, and with the driftwood made new stairs. So all that wood that you see there creating the new stairs was found on the beach. And then there, on the upper right, is the stove, the old stove that had broken. That's in the Walker Evans book. And he said, well, we'll use that too. So this ability to make from what he encountered ever more marvelous things, I think has a lot to do. That's the back stairs. Incredible ability to release the inner energy. Closer? Sorry about that. I won't repeat. That's Robert and June a few years ago. A story that will be told one day is the incredible love between these two people and how much they were in awe of each other. I heard him say often how much in awe he was of how hard she worked every day, down to the studio, up, down. She would look at him and say, he doesn't work at all. How does he do it? He it never seems to be working. Of course, we talked about that every times, and my best way of saying it, he was like a flying eagle. He was always soaring, always alert, always paying attention. And when he came down, he landed on the mouse. He knew exactly what he was doing, but his eyes were always open and looking. This is the two of them in Mabou one day, out walking, and she got very ill. So this is as we stopped in front of the local hospital there, before going in the emergency room. Fortunately, they knew who he was, so they took care of him. But that wasn't always true in New York. Very often in New York, when we'd run off to the emergency room at night, they'd want to send him in the room with all the bums. And they didn't give him the same cover. This is Robert, just not far from his house, looking at his life. He looked deeply at the ocean every day. He watched, he looked, he studied. And when asked, June would say, he's thinking about Andrea. He never stopped thinking about his children. And that's what he would look at when he stared. This is a little bit what the inside of the house looked like. It was a marvelous collage of things arranged and rearranged every day and restacked. I was reminded when I saw some Sudak pictures out there yesterday how much energy could be identified and released from otherwise innate objects that sat around. This is the new stove, not the Walker Evans stove. Robert, the house was built in the 19th century. It had just boards, no insulation, no wood. It was meant to be a summer fisherman's cottage, and they lived there for about 50 years. And so he prided himself on the ability to make a fire in this and keep the fire going all night. So he had this is the Swiss German calculation of how many logs he could put in at one time and at what hour he'd have to get back up to put more logs in. This is a 2-log night, a 3-log night, a 1-hour night. That was his game, just counting the number of logs. And always looking at images, always looking at pictures. He never stopped. He made pictures right up to the very end. We still now have several hundred rolls of film of pictures he took the last few years. But always looking, always trying to figure out what to do with it, always deciding, and always rearranging everything in his house. So you'd come one day and the Mountie would be there, the next day he'd be in a different room. Everything danced, sort of like that scene in Disney's Fantasia when everything moves around all the time is dancing. That's what this house was like. Everything moved, and he could identify the inner energy of this, and I call this hands at work. We know what his head did, but now we're seeing what his hands did. And he had many boxes of pictures, and they would be labeled, more or less. But when we got to look, that one that says circus had 2 Peru pictures and 1 picture of whales. And I don't know why, and we've respected that order. We might decode it one day. And then he'd move everything around. Perhaps one of the most interesting things is after he passed away, we found about 70 cans of film all over the house. This is in the closet above the shoes. Cans of film. Many cases they'd been never cut, never edited, so we didn't know what to do with those. So we've digitized all of it, took about a year, and Laura Israel has produced a series of short films called, that you're going to talk about in a minute, scrapbook videos, and they're his films of what he was thinking about all the time. So the 16 and 8 is there, but people would give him video cameras, and he had every generation of video, 8, 6, cassette, and all these things. And some of them, I think, he used until the battery died and then put it down, and the film was never looked at. So we edited all that, put it away. You see some of the films. He worked, and we did at the foundation, to give all of these films to MoMA under the understanding that they will protect and preserve and make copies available to the world. And that film festival starts next month. So he gave the work, they committed to do the work. It's quite wonderful. You know, every day taking pictures. We have many pictures from the final days in his life. Deeply in love between the two. Someday there'll be a great story told, an exhibition about how their work intertwined. Her work is all about him. His work is very much supported by her energy. It's a wonderful story. And he loved to take pictures. So, quick introduction. Lucy's going to talk about the show at MoMA, and we're fortunate to have Sarah here, who did the first 2 great shows ever done about Robert at National Gallery. Thank you.
Thank you, Clark. Thank you, Clark. And I am honored to be here. As a representative, the organizer, together with my colleagues at MoMA, Caitlin Boer, who is the Newhall Curatorial Fellow in our Department of Photography at MoMA, and Casey Lee, who is a year-long intern in the department, work with me on an exhibition that's on view now at the museum. and we'd love for you all to see it. It's just one of many wonderful celebrations of Robert Frank's work at this occasion of his centennial, which is tomorrow, November 9th, 2024. He was born in 1924. Our exhibition wasn't always planned to be on the centennial, but we were so lucky that it was, because we got to work alongside so many other wonderful thinkers and curators and organizers and friends of Robert, of which I am surrounded by two now, and learn from them and work together with them, which was fitting because our project at MoMA is so much about all of the artists and poets and writers and dealers and friends that Robert was working with and publishers for all of his career. One of the projects that's on view in conjunction with an exhibition upstairs at MoMA is the scrapbook footage, which Clark mentioned, which is an installation by Laura Israel and Alex Bingham of this material that Clark showed you of the footage, the cans of film, the videotape that was left in Mabou and mostly on Bleecker Street, that wasn't part of a finished film. So this wasn't something that was related to a finished work, but it was all this footage. Of course, Robert had said it's all scrapbook footage, including the material that ended up in the finished works, which is why they named the project this. And I just wanted to start with this and actually read some of Robert's words that he wrote. It's fitting to read them here at Paris Photo because they were part of the introduction for his Photo Poche book that was published in 1983. So they were first appeared in French, but then were translated into English for the US version. And I will read them in English. And then they work quite well with the idea of the scrapbook footage. And we have very much wanted to center Robert's own words and thoughts that he put into his work throughout our project. So I thought it was fitting to start with them. It goes like this. I'd like to make a film which would mingle the private aspects of my life with my work, which is public by definition. I'd like to make a photo film and work out a dialogue between the movement of the camera and the freezing of the still image, between the present and the past, inside and outside, front and back. I would make this film in a seedy background in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, and New York. 2 houses, 2 countries, 2 points of view. One is outside cultural life and the other right in it. One is the other's refuge. In my film, and because of the very way they float in the current of my normal life, my photographs will become pauses in its flux, breaths of fresh air, windows on another time, on other places. And of course, there will be the usual stream of characters, neighbors, art dealers, lawyers, caretakers, thieves, the swindlers and the swindled, a few friends as well, not forgetting the unexpected guest. All that in 30 minutes. I'd like to make that film. And in a way, the installation has that feeling, and actually so many of the films Robert did make have that feeling alongside his photographs. And hopefully visitors to our show at MoMA will experience that. I'll just share a little bit about the current project that's there on the Centennial. It's called Life Dances On. Life Dances On was a film made in 1980, so just right around the time that Robert was writing those words that I just read. And in the film, June Leaf, Robert's partner, the artist, turns to the camera and asks, "Why do you want to make these pictures?" And throughout the film, he seems to answer that question, and throughout our show, he answers that question. First, he pans the camera around the house that you just saw in Clark's own pictures, and goes on to talk about continuing to live life there and in New York. Some of the film is filmed in New York. And also to continue making work in the face of trauma, of grief, working through his feelings. These are some stills from the film. Just after June asks that question, we hear the radio announcing the births of babies, daughters to local families in Mabou, and the film is dedicated to his own daughter, Andrea, who had died in the years before that in a plane crash, and also to his collaborator and his friend, Danny Seymour, who had died. And he's literally mapping his relationships with these people and memorials to them onto the landscape of where he's living now. It's also very much related to many of the photographs that we all love very much from this time. The footage that was then appeared in that film, it was in these pictures. Some of the first pictures that he made using the gelatin silver enlargement process from the Polaroid positive-negative film that went on to be such an important aspect of his work. And so all of this is coming together in our show, which starts at a very particular moment in his life. Sorry, I also wanted to mention the other part of the title of our show is Robert Frank in Dialogue, and I already talked about that relationship that he had with so many of the people in his life, but making work alongside writers, poets, so that aspect of dialogue and collaboration, but then he also put his own words into the work, literally into the picture, but also narrating his films, and then in the artist's books that are at the center of the show, his words appearing alongside the pictures there. Our show starts at a very particular moment in his life. So after he finished putting together the pictures that would appear in the Americans, Les Americains, he had organized that with Del Pierre up until January of the prior year, and then started this body of work in the summer of 1958. Well, first he made his first film in the summer of 1958, borrowing a film camera from another photographer, filmmaker, Rudy Burkhart, and making a film together with this vibrant artist community that he was living amongst in the summer in Cape Cod. And you see a still from that here. And literally, the camera was borrowed from an artist friend, and then all of the cast and the people in the film were this community around him. And then he also made this body of work from the bus, New York, which is in the collection of the National Gallery in Washington. These pictures were in his show at MoMA in 1962. And later, looking back at these pictures, which were made out of the window of a bus going down Fifth Avenue, he said, when I put these pictures together, which for that show at MoMA in 1962, I knew that I'd come to the end of one chapter, and it was beginning of something new, this beginning of the way he was thinking between still and moving image from then on. And so this provides the beginning of our show at MoMA. The show continues through so many of the artists and musicians and writers that he was working amongst in New York and beyond throughout the 60s into the 70s. And then in Mabou, also the artists that he was working with, and there's works by June Leaf included in the show. She described how at this period in their lives, when they had first moved to Nova Scotia, they were both working with photographs in their pictures. Their home was surrounded by piles of pictures on the tables, and she would also incorporate them into her own drawings. As you see here, they collaborated on drawings, and so in this moment of the show, we're looking at the experiments that they are both doing in both of their practices. It's something that we've done elsewhere in the show. Earlier, there's a moment where we look at the ongoing collaboration between Robert and Allen Ginsberg, for example. Allen appeared in Robert's first film, Pull My Daisy, which he co-made with artist Alfred Leslie. But then they were going to make another film together, Kaddish. They never did, but then Allen returned to Kaddish, his first poem Kaddish, with the poem White Shroud, and Robert made one of his first video works documenting Alan reading White Shroud. So this was this continual ongoing conversation between two artists. Finally, the show ends with Robert's work in the 90s, 2000s. He was working up until he died in 2019. And in this back room of the exhibition, we have a number of his artist books that he published together with Steidl, which you can see just around the corner along the pathway here. We have some of the maquettes of those books that he and Ayumi, who was his assistant and his collaborator on the books, worked amongst themselves, and then Steidl would publish one each year. And we also have some of the pictures that he made in his home. And here, in these years, he was often taking pictures of things in his house and people that were so important to him. I found it really interesting the way he used the word souvenir, which in English, these objects that have a particular importance and memory within them. But of course, being Swiss-German, he also spoke French well, and really that idea of the memory within the object was so important. In the picture, one of the pictures here, there's a row of postcards of Niagara Falls, and underneath it he wrote, I'd like to exchange cards with you, souvenirs preferred. Here he was just referring to postcards, but souvenirs could of course be the books that he exchanged with his audiences. He also used the word souvenirs about his photographs. And this is my segue to turn it over to Sarah, because Sarah was one of these people that it was just such an honor to work alongside in preparing this show because of all of the work she's done with Robert Frank over the years. But she was in particular thinking about Robert's exchange of postcards and other things for our book and beyond. So there you go.
Thank you, Lucy. If you had asked me a year ago if I would be writing something for the MoMA catalog, I would have said no. I don't possibly have time to do it. So I want to start by, first of all, thanking Lucy for prodding me into writing the essay that I did write for the MoMA catalog. It was something that I had been thinking about for a very long time. I wanted to do something focused on Frank's letters. And in my probably overly scholarly, methodical way, I had at first thought that, of course, I had to survey the entire world and find all of Frank's letters before I could write an essay for MoMA. And it was Lucy who encouraged me to focus more on, to make it very personal, to focus on the letters that Frank had written to me and a handful of other people, which is what I did. And I have to say, when I wrote the essay, it was one of the most fun essays I have ever written in my life, mainly because it allowed me to go back and to look through all of the letters that I had received from Frank over the years. I first met Frank in early 1990 when he was thinking about trying to find a home for his large collection of archival material made before 1970, mainly the archival material related to the publication of the Americans. And that work did come to the National Gallery in 1990, along with hundreds of other vintage exhibition photographs. It was an extraordinary donation. And very soon after I first met him, I began to receive letters from him. And I think, like so many people who received letters from Frank, I was immediately charmed by their very personal, but also quirky, idiosyncratic nature. and even more by the way that they revealed somebody who was utterly, utterly different from the public persona that he projected of a gruff recluse. But over time, I also began to see that, as I came to understand that Frank was really somebody who created work out of the chaos around him, and I could see that reflected in his letters. And I began to understand that his letters were not only a really extraordinary source of information about his history, his character, his thoughts, his ambitions at the time, but also his working methods. Clark mentioned how Frank was a squirrel. That's very true. Jim Jarmusch, who I think is talking next, once said in an interview that Frank was somebody who collected things and piled them up around his house until the objects told him what to do with them. And you very much see that in Frank's letters. He frequently sent letters that would be adorned with brightly colored stamps, often of small denomination, and rotated on their side or upside down. He wrote them on what was close at hand, from airmail stationery to pages torn from notebooks. He also loved to write them on stationery from hotels, stationery that he'd purloined from hotels that may or may not have indicated his recent travels or even where he was at the moment. He also frequently wrote them on long out-of-date stationery. This is Low Road Production, which was the name of one of his film companies. There was another one that had the motto, "If it moves, we film it." As Clark and Lucy have mentioned, he loved postcards, not the kinds of postcards that you buy at the tourist shop, but older, often black and white ones, sometimes ones from film stills. This is one from a film still, which he wrote. If you can read it on the back of the envelope, it was the film still from a film called The Quai des Brumes, The Port of Shadows. And Frank wrote, "It was my favorite when I was young and bushy-tailed." But then he went on to say that, the film is 50 years old. He too was 50 years older and obviously no longer so bushy-tailed, and he needed to go back to New York for a stress test before he would be able to do any of the activities that these actors had done. Some were postcards that he thought were maybe too racy to send through the mail at the National Gallery, so he would put them into envelopes, such as this one. Another one of my favorites was this one, which he sent to me just shortly before the opening of our 1994 exhibition at the National Gallery, which was called Moving Out. And it's the picture of a rock slide in Canada. And if you can read the legend down at the bottom, the rock slide is called the Frank Slide. On the back of it, you can see he wrote, "Dear Sarah, hold on." Years later, around the time of our 2008-2009 show on the Americans, he sent me another postcard, which I fortunately couldn't put my hands on, which was called The Devil's Slide. And on that inscription, he asked me if I remembered the Frank Slide, that I should be prepared for it. His letters also were frequently adorned with funny, silly things. You'd often find stickers of fish, or maybe even baseballs and maple leaves. They were frequently typed on a very temperamental typewriter that would have clogged letters, and it wouldn't stay in line. You can see how it sort of drifts out of line there. The capitalization, the punctuation in the letters was always minimal and erratic. It almost seemed as if they were like a beat poem that had been written in sort of one long breath. Many of them recounted dry details about his everyday life, exhibitions that he was working on, books that he was working on, but they were often frequently very amusing. There was one that he wrote me in 1998 from Mabou, in which he said, "The grass is very green, the crows successful and black, lobsters silent and sad." Frank could frequently be very blunt and harsh, as Clark was saying, particularly if he felt that his work had been wronged, that he was being misrepresented. But in general, the letters were really very warm and generous. The photographer Jim Goldberg once remarked that getting a letter from Frank was such a warm and embracing feeling. He felt as if Frank had wrapped his arms around him. In addition, if you start reading through the letters, you can see that Frank deploys words in the letters in much the same way that he does in his photographs from this time. If you can read the words in this picture of Halifax Infirmary, you can see hospital, hope, therapy, nuclear. They become just lists of words. He did that same thing in some of his letters. He wrote to the curator, Philip Brookman from Mabou, "As the ice moves forward, I retreat." Or again, in another letter to Philip, he wrote that this was the entire letter: nature, all around, raining, blowing, shining sun, fog, thunder, night. Just simply a list of words in the same way that we have in this photograph. But also in this photograph, as you can see at the bottom of the stack of pictures, Frank's written, "The wind will blow the fire of pain across everyone in time." And the way his pictures could be so poetic, so moving in just these simple little phrases, he did that same thing in his letters. He wrote to Philip again that London in the 1950s was black, white, gray, the elegance, the style, all present in front of always changing fog. Excuse me, 1 second. You also never knew what was going to fall out of a letter from Frank. Many would be adorned with his own amusing little sketches. This is him mowing the grass in Mabou. This is him responding to the commercialism of the art world. Frequently, though, he would stick photographs into the letters. Sometimes they'd be strips from contact sheets. Very often, though, they'd be Polaroids. Sometimes he would tape the Polaroids down with brightly colored tape. Other times they'd just be loose in the letters. This is another one of his great letters from the time. 2 Polaroids just stuck in this letter. And he wrote that these shoes that we see with this wonderful witty and rueful play on words, he wrote, "The shoes are my father's. I wore them a lot when I took them back from Zurich about 10 years ago, but coming back from Mabou at a stop at Andover, I could not continue in my father's shoes." And then a couple of weeks later, reporting from Portugal, he included a picture of another pair of shoes, and he wrote, "Short trip from Andover to New York City through the sea to the shore in Portugal. Immediate realization that no information relating to new footwear has been made available." But many of the photographs that Frank included in his letters go far beyond these sort of humorous greetings or oblique allusions to his preoccupations. And they really get at the way Frank was always investigating the way images and words could complicate one another. And you see that in particular in this letter, which he wrote to his friend and dealer, Peter McGill, shortly after he had stayed at a hospital, had an operation at a hospital in Nova Scotia. And he wrote the letter while listening to Hank Williams singing Lost on the River of Life, which Frank amusingly translated into this. I realize it's hard to read this letter, but he translated the title of the song from the River of Life to the River of Light. Very good for a photographer. And he wrote to Frank. He wrote to Peter McGill by saying, quoting some of the lines from the song, saying, "You better keep it on your mind all the time. Dark is the night. Lost on the river, like the blind praying for sight. Tomorrow you'll be another man's wife." And then he goes on in his letter to Peter McGill, and he includes a reference to Operation Desert Storm and the Gulf War, which had started only a few days before he'd gone into the hospital. And he noted that President George Herbert Walker Bush is going to make a new world order. A new world order was a phrase that Bush used often at that time to describe a new post-Cold War strategy. And as Frank sort of continued to reflect on this idea, he worked with other Polaroids that he had made during that hospital visit, images that include screens, pictures of screens, as well as bombing sites, television sets, and other transparent surfaces. And then when he put all of this together in a final photograph, you can see how he continues to sort of ruminate on these same ideas, flipping the images around, moving them around to make a more effective composition. And he's really, I think, working with the idea of how screens, which were used so extensively, obviously by both the military, but also medical technology at that time, enabling us to see things which we might not otherwise be able to see. Finally, getting back to this picture that I started with, it's one of my favorite photographs that Frank sent to me. You can see that it's several contact strips taped down onto a piece of stationery, which is decorated with the stars and stripes of the American flag. Obviously, the flag is a symbol that Frank had used extensively in his photographs over the years. It may also possibly be a nod to my home in Washington, D.C., but you can also see that it's pictures of the Mabou landscape, the trees blowing in front of the house, the shoreline in front of the house. Everything is slightly blurry because of the wind, no doubt, that was swept up the hillside from the ocean, but also because of the cheap nature of the camera that he was using. You can also see in the lower right the way there are streaks in the picture. The streaks are probably from a light leak that occurred in the camera, but they give this sense of a really magical place. And Frank, you can see, wrote above the picture, Mabou last summer, and then beneath it, "Dear Sarah, outside it's always changing, we know. Days are getting shorter and darker. I wish you many more real New Years. Stay healthy. Salut, Robert." I had so much fun working on this project for MoMA, but I also really came to realize that Frank's letters from this period that I analyzed, which was really just from 1990 to the end of his life, they contained so much new information about him, about his working methods, about his practice, that I have decided that I want to continue this project. And so I'm going to start working on a book of his letters from throughout his career, from the 1940s on. If any of you know anyone who might have some letters, please contact me afterwards. Thank you all.
Thank you both. I think with that, we want to take questions in a minute, but we want to just tell you briefly some of what's going on the Centenary. The Americans, his most extraordinary, well-known book, is back in print. Stidle's produced it for Aperture. We're happy to make this and many of the books that Robert made that went out of print to put them back into print. We figured out that they stopped being produced about 40 years ago, and you bought them at 20, you had to be 60 to actually go to a bookstore. Well, they're all going to be out and fresh again. There's also this remarkable show at MoMA. Oh, sorry, this is the Pace one. I don't know if Lauren is in here, but hey, thank you. Lauren and Scheherazade with the foundation have produced a remarkable look at some of the pictures that have never been seen. I mentioned how extraordinary it is that he continued to work and work and work and go deeper and deeper without traveling more than 10 meters from his desk. That's going to be a remarkable show. We have Sonder in Cologne is putting on a remarkable show of Flower Is here in Paris and Rue Jacob. It's a small gallery. It's quite remarkable. And he's also got Robert's copy of The Americans on display in Cologne. We also no doubt that the Museum Volkwang in Essen is putting on a remarkable show from their collection. All of this right now in the Centenary. And the MFA in Boston is going to produce a show in December about a book he made for Mary. It's a love poem between Robert and Mary when they were in Paris in the early 50s. And it's a remarkable little book of pure love between two people. And it's really, again, remarkable how deep and inspiring this book's going to be. I might also say there's one more show that we can announce from last night. The Pompidou here in Paris has decided and made a commitment to make a major acquisition of Frank's work from the foundation and elsewhere, and will be putting together an extraordinary show in the next year or two somewhere where they choose. But it's the most important major commitment of anybody in Europe as far as we know. With that, I think we've addressed everything. I don't know if we have time for questions. Are we all right? Do we have any questions in the room? And thank you all for coming.
I also wanted to mention, Clark mentioned that at MoMA we will have a film program coming up, and there are so many, we wanted to shout out to some of these other things that are happening on Robert's Centennial. At MoMA, we're doing a complete retrospective, our colleagues in the film department. That will start on November 20th. If you find yourself in New York and want to see one of the films in full, it's a complete retrospective, but many of them are showing elsewhere at this time, so that's exciting.
We want the world to know more.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Friend of Robert. I met him at the Centre Culturel Suisse 30 years ago, and I was a young photographer at the time, and they told me, come to eat afterwards. Robert will be there. So we had been eating, and we only spoke Swiss German. So then I had a big friendship with him. So one day I said I have to go to make some street photography with him. So we went together to Zurich, to his place, and we took pictures in Zurich. Then we went to Brooklyn. That was in 2014. And I tell you that because this is now exposed in the Espace MVG here in Paris. And you can come and go. There's 5 pictures of Robert which you never have seen because they are from Zurich, they're from Brooklyn. We did them together. And he wrote on the film also because he used an old instant film which was dried up. And only half of the picture was developed, and he wrote things on the things. And there is also a little film we just mounted, finished yesterday. And it's new, and it's all the material I filmed with him. So we went over the peak. He was not so well on his feet. So when he went into his car, I knew that he is real American because then he hurried up the Brooklyn Bridge, about 120 kilometers. Ayumi and I, who had been in the car, feared that it's dangerous. And so you can come and see that at the Espace MVG. So go Google Maps, and Espace MVG is there, and you find it.
I hope you all get to see it.
You can get them.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Anybody else? I can't see if there's a hand. Be brave. Well, I go back to the very beginning and ask you all as you wander away to think about why he impacted so many people so deeply. Got a little glimpse here this afternoon, but look again at the work. I think he got to the inner soul of what it means to be alive and deal with the opportunity and dilemma of living. Yes, Lauren.
A little bit more about Sarah. I know you've done so many exhibitions with Robert. Lucy, when you started working on the current show at MoMA, Robert was still with us, so he was a part of that process. So I would love for the two of you to just talk about how was it to work with Robert?
Well, I'll start because I have actually a question for Lucy, too, that we did the show in 1994 called Moving Out at the National Gallery, and it was at that moment of full retrospective. Philip Brookman and I did it together, so it looked at Frank's work from the 40s up until 1994. There were pictures that were made just before the exhibition opened. I can tell you one amusing anecdote from that exhibition. We had phrased it all along as a full-scale retrospective, which meant that it had to include pictures from the Americans. When Philip and I sent Robert when we sent him the complete selection of what we wanted to show in the exhibition, Robert returned all of the photocopies to us, and he had taken out all but 3 pictures from the Americans because he did not want to include those. And this was still during that time when he was very much distancing himself from the Americans. Also, another amusing anecdote from working on that project, we did a chronology in the back of the book. And just before that book was about to be published, just as we were doing the chronology, the Whitney had opened a show of Avedon's work, which had a huge chronology on Avedon's development with many, many pictures of Avedon in the chronology. When Frank saw the images that we wanted to illustrate in our chronology, he faxed me right away to say, I can't believe you're going to include all of these pictures of me in the chronology. And so he could be, as I said, he could be very blunt, very sharp when he felt that he was being misrepresented. But I think he equally respected people when they stood up and explained the reasons why they had made these choices. So many more than 3 pictures from the Americans were included in the 1994 exhibition. But it was at that time when that exhibition went up on the walls that in walking through it, I realized that 2008, 2009 would be the 50th anniversary of the Americans. And it was at that moment in 94 that I knew we had to do that show in 2008, because the National Gallery has all the contact sheets, all the work prints for the Americans. It really shows his process of putting that together. And I also knew, though, that I couldn't possibly propose that exhibition to Robert in 1994, that he would have turned it down flat. So I waited, I bided my time until the early 2000s after the Tate did a big show that focused on Frank as a filmmaker. And I knew that once that happened, Frank would feel more confident that, you know, his work in the sort of second half of his career was getting the attention that it deserved. And so only then could I propose it. But my question to Lucy is, now that you've finished doing this exhibition, is there another Frank exhibition that you could think about doing?
Gosh, I wasn't prepared for that question. Well, you know, one of the things that we've talked about, I think, now that the show has been up for a couple of months and we've had so many visitors come and talk with us about it, that has been one of the most rewarding things about it is the response from young artists, from artists in general, but especially from young artists. And I've noticed this in things that have been written about the show, some of the younger critics and young voices responding to it. This idea of an artist that's always wanting to keep pushing forward, experimenting in different ways, wanting to push themselves in their practice, and then groups that have come with, you know, class groups that have come or faculty who have come and said, oh, this work has always just been so important for my students. We put at the heart of the show Robert's book, The Lines of My Hand, and that was a moment actually when we could include a couple pictures from the Americans, but really at that moment that he made the book in 1972, he was both looking back at what he had made up until that point, which included the Americans, but other pictures as well, and then looking ahead to where he was now and taking stock of being in Mabou and what lied in front of him. And just that way of an artist thinking about their own practice and then you see it play out, I can just sense his influence, but just inspiration, I guess, on so many young artists. And I'd love to hear more about that and talk more about that with all of them. So that could be a project that could come next.
I have one idea we've all talked about a little bit. We know Sarah did the work that he learned the craft from several photographers in Zurich before he came to the United States. He was a master in the darkroom and a master printer. But what happened decades later, not only did he know how to construct a picture, he knew how to deconstruct a picture. So he could work with a negative, put a piece of glass on top, write on the glass, scratch on the glass, put another thing, and create these sandwiches of images and cutting and scraping and destroying and recreating, and then photograph that again. So while you've seen some of those pictures with the words, we have the pictures that precede. So you may see one, but we don't know the 19 he made to choose finally number 14. Somebody said he was a conceptual artist. I think he was so far in advance and didn't even know that word. But how hard he worked at both creating and then unwinding and recreating it is as if he wanted to make the problem ever more difficult for himself at every opportunity. Yes, sir, Bill.
What do you miss about him?
Oh,
Okay.
say it again, please. Yes.
That's a really hard one. Robert was a force of nature. He was so genuine. His friendship, his warmth. I miss him being sort of constantly in the background of my life. I mean, you know, when we were working on the exhibitions, we were in contact a lot. But when we weren't, you know, I would get letters frequently and also telephone calls, faxes. Never once did I get an email from him, though. But I miss those greetings from him in a way. I miss the friendship.
I'll go back to the empathy. He deeply cared, and it was evident. When I had a family member in the hospital, he called every day for 2 years.
I mean, I'm going to answer this in a different way because, as Lauren said, I got to know Frank only at the end of his life in his 90s. We started working on the show in the last years of his life. And so actually, what's been so special for me has been just the joy of working with so many people that knew him well. We worked very closely with June, and her support of his work, which I understand went likewise, his support of her work and of other artists in his life. But working alongside so many folks who were interested in remembering him and remembering his work, and the fact that we were able to do that has been, in fact, the opposite of missing, but having his presence there, I guess.
Anybody else want to give an answer to that question? What do you miss? Yes, sir.
I had extremely good fortune to know Robert. I have to call him Robert Frank. I always, for a while in the mid-1980s, we were commissioned by American Photographer magazine to photograph the 1984 Democratic Convention in San Francisco together. And when I met him, I was out on Powell Street photographing by myself, and I had this whole, the light was perfect, I had everything. I said, this is my corner. Everybody else is in a convention. So out of the corner of my eye, I see a photographer standing next to, about 5 feet from me. And he really, you know, street photographers, we have a visual language. There's a way that you kind of move through atmospheres and people. And I knew right away. I said, are you Robert? Because we were supposed to meet. I said, are you Robert Frank? And he looked at me for a minute or two, and he said, yes. And then I will say this to this whole audience. I hugged him. I hugged Robert Frank. And he allowed me to hug him. And I had to say, I said, I'm sure you're sick of hearing this, but you have been an inspiration to me in my life and generations of photographers. And that's it. I won't say that again. And after that, we met several times in New York. I went to visit him. But while we were in San Francisco, we were going to meet and go to the Hooker's Ball to photograph. And he needed to borrow some film. So, and he said, here's where I'm staying. So I called the number, and it was a laundromat. Oh, this laundromat. And I said, well, I was trying to get, is this a hotel, motel? Oh, yeah, it's a motel, too. So he was kind of saying it a combination. Anyway, then I got to visit him several times in New York, and he was always very gracious and supportive and encouraging. And that's the empathy thing. You know, but he didn't suffer fools either. You've all mentioned that. I mean, he had an opinion immediately, and you just had to be honest and direct and sincere, and he always respected that. And my beautiful wife I sent it to Sarah, my beautiful wife Susan found a letter that he wrote to me, encouraging me on a particular project. And he would make coffee in his coffee pot on Bleecker Street. It looked like it was from the Bronze Age, but it was really great. And he got me pastries from the Bowery Grocery. And okay, I'll shut up now. But he was just really. I'm just echoing what all of you have said so beautifully. I mean, he was a great artist and a great inspiration to me.
Thank you.
My
Shall
pleasure.
we use the word inspiring? I think our time is up unless somebody... Thank you all for being here. Go make great pictures.